New technology, isn't it wonderful? You can text, scroll through social media, look at the History Chronicles, or, if you're lucky, even make a phone call from time to time. But the latest gadgets haven't always been viewed in history with such enthusiasm. In 19th century Britain, a wave of violent protests swept through industrialised towns, destroying newly developed equipment and factory machinery in its wake. Today on the History Chronicles, we are going to look at the origins of this peculiar type of protest that rose in the wake of Britain's Industrial Revolution. Let's look at the history of the Luddites. At the turn of the 19th century, Britain was undergoing momentous change. New inventions were rapidly transforming the way in which goods were manufactured. The spinning jenny had been invented by the English weaver James Hargreaves in 1765 and had now found its way into numerous textile mills up and down the country. The device cut down the amount of work needed to produce cloth. It consisted of a metal frame with a set of spindles at one end, allowing one worker control over 8 spools of thread rather than just a single spool, which had previously been the case in cloth production. Mr. Hargreaves kept his invention a secret at first, but by 1770 the spinning jenny had woven its way into several factories in Lancashire, one of the heartlands of the British cotton industry. In 1810 this invention was superseded by the spinning mule, a similar invention that further sped up the process of spinning cotton. By 1825 there were 50 million mule spindles in Lancashire alone, giving one example of just how quickly manufacturing methods could develop in this period of rapid industrial change. For some who lived and worked in this rapidly changing world, the rise of new technology was to spark a certain resentment. The advent of such devices in the textile industry began to take work quite literally out of the hands of traditional handloom weavers. Sure, it was more productive to move textile development into a factory environment for a company owner, but such a move concerned itself little with the well-being of those who worked on the factory floor. Earlier in the 18th century, England's large textile market had been dominated by so-called cottage industries, local producers who had clubbed together in guilds and friendly societies to protect themselves against sickness and the entry of foreign labour into their markets. These local producers were now eclipsed by the advent of large-scale production with cutting-edge technology on the factory floor. The story goes that in the year of 1779, a certain young weaver in Leicester broke into a fit of rage. In his fiery anger, he smashed 2 stocking frames used in textile production. The weaver's name was Ned Ludd. There is little evidence for this tale beyond 18th century folklore, but this antagonist became known as Captain, General, or even sometimes King Ludd. His actions were to spawn a movement of angered protest against new technology in the factories of the Industrial Revolution. The Luddites, as they were known, took off several decades after the angry outburst of Ned Ludd. In 1811 they began meeting on the moors of Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire, gathering in militaristic drill-like manoeuvres. They would write threatening letters to their employers in the textile mills, chiefly objecting to the use of new machinery that allowed factory owners to make use of cheaper, unskilled labour. When the demands were not met, they burst into the mills. By February 1812 they were responsible for the destruction of over 1,000 frames in Nottingham, at an estimated cost of almost £10,000, around $1.4 million in today's money. Why smash up all this equipment? Well, breaking machinery was just about the only way that these workers could have their voices heard. The 1810s saw incredible hardship among the working class in Britain. The Napoleonic Wars, which still raged on across the Channel and through the seas, limited British trade and imports. Furthermore, the impact of the American Revolution back in 1775 continued to inflict long-term damage on the British economy. British exports to the American continent as a proportion of total trade dropped by 30% between 1802 and 1806. As a result, this period saw irregular rises in food prices and high unemployment that drove many to the brink of starvation. The early 1800s were therefore a period of immense unrest in Britain. Outside of the factories, frustration with the government also manifested itself in violent protest in the swing riots of 1830. Just as the Luddites smashed looms in the factories, farmers in the swing riots took their anger out on their own threshing machines. Machinery was, after all, the only visible enemy in the ever unsteady and harsh world about them. The government response to the Luddites was swift and punitive. The outbreak of violence that had swept through Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire in 1811 to 1812 led to the passing of the Frame Breaking Act in the British Parliament. This made the deliberate destruction of weaving frames a crime punishable by death. Such a response may seem just a little harsh, but what we must remember here is that there existed a deeper fear in the British middle and upper classes of this period. This was the fear of revolution. Only 2 decades before, the French monarchy and ruling elite had been engulfed in the French Revolution. Since then, Britain had for the most part been at war with the new revolutionary government, then after that the dictatorship of Napoleon. Any such unrest in Britain itself in this time of war, it was argued, had to be nipped in the bud as quickly as possible to prevent the spread of revolutionary sentiment. The Frame Breaking Act, despite its severity, failed to deter Luddite protest. Luddite assaults and raids of factories continued in the northern industrial heartlands of Britain. So it was that in the first months of 1812 the British government sent 12,000 soldiers to deal with the Luddites. This force was larger than that led by the Duke of Wellington in one of the campaigns against Napoleon. The mill owner William Cartwright called for soldiers to protect the machines at his mill in Rawford in Yorkshire. In April 1812, Cartwright's mill was attacked by a group of 150 protesters, some of them Luddites themselves. In the confrontation that ensued, 2 Luddites were shot and killed. The violence of this altercation set the precedent for further fatalities. One particularly outspoken mill owner, William Horsfall, remarked that he would ride up to his saddle in Luddite blood. Horsfall was ambushed and assassinated by a Luddite hit squad at the Crossland Moor in Huddersfield, Yorkshire. All the men were captured in the end. Of the 4, 1 was turned an informant. The others were hanged, along with 14 others associated with the assassins. Harsh sentences were applied to any found guilty of Luddite crimes. These included execution, but also transportation to Australia, Britain's penal colony overseas. Not every trial, though, was a government success. In 1813, Cartwright's mill was attacked by a large group of over 60 men. The men were charged en masse in York Crown Court with crimes in connection to Luddite activities. Due to the little evidence that could be presented in court, though, 30 of these men were soon acquitted. The fact remained, however, that the government response to Luddism was working. The show trial following Horsfall's murder and the fatal penalty of the Frame Breaking Act eventually had their consequence. Within 5 years, from 1812 to 1817, Luddite action slowed and effectively died away. Fear and swift government action had rendered it inoperable. Today, the word Luddite is used in the English language to denote those fearful of or opposed to technological development. But the reasons of the actual Luddites for their protest tell us a slightly different story. Here were the efforts of skilled craftsmen and artisans who sought to challenge a system in which the odds were increasingly stacked against them. They showed their opposition in the only way they could, by targeting the equipment which they believed had allowed poorly paid, less skilled workers to replace them. In this emotive and violent response to change, we as historians might get a glimpse into the upheavals of Britain in the time of the Industrial Revolution. Thank you for watching this episode of the History Chronicles. Please do like our video, subscribe if you can, and if you want to, please do support us on Patreon too. I'll see you again for some more history.